My name is Indira Caulfield, and exactly 37 days ago, while I was sitting across from three executives about to sign the biggest contract in my company's history, my phone buzzed with a text message that destroyed everything I'd built over 3 years. The message was from Ethan Crowley, the CEO's 26-year-old son who'd never closed a deal worth more than $50,000 in his life. It said, "Clean out your desk tonight. Security will escort you out Monday morning. Your employment is terminated effective immediately." I was literally holding a pen, about to close a $28 million contract with Pennington Industries, when this kid decided to end my career via text message because he was jealous of my success. I sat there staring at my phone while the three executives waited for me to sign the final page. My heart was pounding, but somehow I managed to look up at them and say, "Gentlemen, there's been a change in representation. I won't be handling this account moving forward." The confusion on their faces was immediate. They started asking questions, but I just gathered my papers, shook their hands, and walked out of that conference room knowing exactly what I was going to do next. Before I go deeper into what happened, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching people. And also like, subscribe, and click the bell icon because what I'm about to tell you next is going to blow your mind. And you're not going to want to miss a single detail of how I took down an entire company using nothing but the truth they never bothered to discover about me. See, what Ethan Crowley didn't know, what nobody at Hammond Solutions knew, was why I was so incredibly good at closing deals that should have been impossible. While my colleagues struggled to meet basic monthly quotas, I was consistently bringing in contracts worth millions. They thought I was just naturally gifted at sales, maybe lucky, or that I had some special charm with clients. The reality was much simpler and much more devastating than they could have imagined. My family owns Caulfield Manufacturing, a specialty component business that's been operating for 22 years. We make custom parts, handle specialized logistics, provide industrial services that most companies have to source from multiple vendors. When I started at Hammond Solutions 3 years ago, I noticed immediately that their profit margins were thin because their supply chain costs were astronomical. They were paying premium prices for everything because they didn't have the relationships or the volume to negotiate better deals. So I made a decision that I thought was helping everyone. I quietly arranged for my family's business to supply components and services to Hammond Solutions at cost, sometimes even at a loss. My parents and my brother thought I was crazy, but they trusted me. They figured the steady volume would eventually pay off, and they wanted to support my career. For 3 years, Caulfield Manufacturing basically subsidized Hammond Solutions' biggest contracts, allowing me to offer clients prices that our competitors couldn't match. Every major deal I closed was possible because my family was absorbing the difference between market rates and what Hammond Solutions actually paid for materials and services. The $28 million Pennington contract, that was profitable for Hammond Solutions only because Caulfield Manufacturing was prepared to supply specialized components at 30% below market rate. The $15 million Apex Industries deal from last year, Caulfield Manufacturing handled logistics and specialized fabrication at cost. The $12 million Thornfield Group contract? Same story. I never told anyone at Hammond Solutions about these arrangements. In my mind, I was just being resourceful, using my connections to help the company succeed. I figured eventually I'd be promoted to a position where I could negotiate these relationships officially, maybe even bring Caulfield Manufacturing on as an official partner. I thought I was building something sustainable, but Ethan Crowley had been watching my success with growing resentment. He'd graduated from college 2 years ago with a business degree and expected to waltz into a senior position immediately. Instead, he had to watch me, someone without family connections or an Ivy League education, consistently outperform everyone else in the company. His father kept promoting me, giving me bigger territories, better commission structures, while Ethan struggled to close even small accounts. What finally pushed him over the edge was when his father mentioned promoting me to regional director, a position Ethan had been lobbying for since he started. That's when he decided to flex the only power he had, which was his last name. He waited until I was in the most important meeting of my career, literally moments away from closing the biggest deal in company history, to send that text message. He thought he was destroying me, but what he actually did was hand me the keys to destroy him. The morning after I got fired, I called my father at Caulfield Manufacturing. I said, "Dad, remember all those special pricing arrangements I asked for with Hammond Solutions? I need you to cancel every single one of them. Effective immediately. Return to market rates for everything." My father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Indira, are you sure? That's going to affect a lot of their active contracts." I said, "Dad, they just fired me via text message while I was closing the biggest deal of my career. I'm absolutely sure." Within 24 hours, every supplier that Caulfield Manufacturing had connected Hammond Solutions with received calls about pricing adjustments. See, over 3 years, my family hadn't just been providing components at cost. They'd also introduced Hammond Solutions to their entire network of partner suppliers, convincing those suppliers to extend favorable pricing because of the relationship with Caulfield Manufacturing. All of those relationships evaporated overnight. Component costs that had been subsidized suddenly jumped to market rates. Specialized services that had been provided at cost suddenly tripled in price. Logistics arrangements that had been handled through family connections suddenly required premium pricing. The Pennington Industries contract that I'd walked away from, when Hammond Solutions tried to deliver at the promised price point, they discovered that their actual costs were 40% higher than projected. The deal went from a $6 million profit to a $3 million loss. But that was just the beginning. 18 other active contracts suddenly became unprofitable. The Apex Industries deal, the Thornfield Group contract, every major account I'd been managing was based on pricing that was only possible because of arrangements that no longer existed. Hammond Solutions faced a choice: honor the contracts and lose millions, or breach the agreements and face lawsuits. Ethan Crowley spent 2 weeks frantically trying to understand what had happened. He called supplier after supplier, demanding explanations for the sudden price increases. Nobody could give him answers that made sense. The suppliers just said their costs had changed. Their capacity was committed elsewhere. Their pricing structure had been updated. Finally, someone mentioned Caulfield Manufacturing. Ethan had never heard the name before, but when he researched it, he found a successful component business with an excellent reputation and a client list that included some very impressive companies. He called my father directly. The conversation was apparently very short. My father later told me that Ethan had demanded to know why Caulfield Manufacturing was no longer providing services to Hammond Solutions, and why all their partner suppliers had suddenly changed pricing. My father simply said, "Our arrangements were with Indira Caulfield. She's no longer with your company, so those arrangements no longer exist." That's when Ethan realized what he'd done. That's when he understood that my success hadn't been luck or charm or natural talent. It had been 3 years of my family essentially donating their profits to make Hammond Solutions competitive. But the real twist was still coming. While Ethan was scrambling to understand the supply chain disaster, I was launching Caulfield Consulting. I'd spent 3 years learning every detail of Hammond Solutions' business model, their client relationships, their pricing strategies, their weaknesses. I knew exactly which of their clients were unhappy, which accounts were vulnerable, which relationships were held together by nothing but inertia. I also knew something else. Caulfield Manufacturing's capacity was about to become available. All those resources that had been supporting Hammond Solutions contracts could now be dedicated to new clients. Clients who were willing to pay market rates for exceptional service. My first call was to Pennington Industries. I explained that there had been a change in my employment situation, and that I was now operating as an independent consultant with access to manufacturing resources that could handle their project more efficiently than Hammond Solutions ever could. I offered them the same deal, but this time with honest pricing and transparent partnerships. They signed with me that afternoon. $28 million moved from Hammond Solutions to Caulfield Consulting in a single phone call. The second call was to Apex Industries. Same conversation, same result. $15 million. By the end of the week, I'd contacted every major client I'd developed relationships with over 3 years. Most of them were frustrated with Hammond Solutions anyway, dealing with rising costs and declining service quality. When I offered them a direct relationship with the manufacturing resources they actually needed, at honest prices with transparent partnerships, the decision was easy. Within 3 weeks, Hammond Solutions had lost $67 million in active contracts. Their supply costs had increased by 40%. Their profit margins had completely evaporated. Ethan Crowley went from thinking he'd eliminated his biggest rival to watching the entire company collapse around him. The final piece of my revenge was the most satisfying. Hammond Solutions Bank called in their credit line when the financial situation became clear. They needed immediate capital injection to avoid bankruptcy. Ethan's father started making desperate calls to potential investors, looking for someone willing to buy into a company with a destroyed supply chain and a decimated client base. That's when I made my offer. Caulfield Consulting, backed by Caulfield Manufacturing's assets and the $67 million in contracts I'd secured, offered to acquire Hammond Solutions' remaining assets for exactly $1. The acquisition included their office building, their remaining client relationships, their equipment, and their staff. Everyone except Ethan Crowley, whose employment I terminated on his first day working for me. I handed him his termination letter personally. I said, "Ethan, there's been a change in your employment status. Clean out your desk. Security will escort you out in 30 minutes." The look on his face was worth 3 years of subsidizing his family's business. But here's what makes this story even better, and why you need to stick around for the second part. What I discovered after the acquisition was that Ethan hadn't just been jealous of my success. He'd been actively sabotaging other employees, manipulating client relationships, and covering up serious financial irregularities that his father knew nothing about. The revenge I thought was complete was actually just the beginning. If you want to hear about what I found in those files, what Ethan had really been doing to the company, and how my revenge became something much bigger than I ever planned, you need to hit that notification bell right now, because part 2 of this story is going to shock you. The text message that destroyed my career ended up uncovering a scandal that reached much higher than just one spoiled kid with daddy issues. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. 3 days after Ethan cleaned out his desk, I was sitting in what used to be his father's office, going through 5 years of financial records that I now legally owned. I'd expected to find evidence of poor management, maybe some questionable decisions that explained why the company had been struggling despite my successful contracts. What I found instead made me realize that my revenge had accidentally uncovered something much more serious than a spoiled kid's jealousy. Someone had been stealing from Hammond Solutions for years. Not small amounts, not petty cash or expense account fraud. We're talking about systematic embezzlement of hundreds of thousands of dollars per quarter, carefully hidden through fake vendor payments, inflated service contracts, and phantom consulting fees. The theft was so sophisticated that it had been completely invisible until I started comparing the financial records to the actual contracts I'd been closing. Here's what made my blood run cold. My family's subsidized pricing had been perfectly masking the embezzlement. Every time Caulfield Manufacturing provided services at cost, the difference between market rate and what Hammond Solutions actually paid was being pocketed by someone who had access to vendor payments. My family had been unknowingly providing cover for a major financial crime. I spent the next 12 hours building a timeline of the theft, cross-referencing bank records with contract details, vendor payments with actual deliveries. The pattern became crystal clear around 2 a.m. Someone with administrative access had been creating fake supplemental charges on every major contract, billing clients for services that were never provided, then pocketing the difference. The really twisted part? The theft had accelerated dramatically over the past year, right around the time Ethan started showing serious interest in my accounts. I'd assumed he was just jealous of my success, but looking at these records, I realized he might have been trying to investigate something he didn't understand. That's when I found the email folder buried deep in the company server. Ethan had been corresponding with someone for months, sending detailed questions about vendor payments, contract structures, and financial processes. The emails were professional but desperate, like someone trying to solve a puzzle they couldn't quite figure out. The person he'd been emailing was Dr. Patricia Hollins, a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud investigations. Ethan had hired her privately, paying her consultation fees from his personal account. asking her to review financial patterns without accessing the actual company records. I called Dr. Hollins the next morning. The conversation lasted 3 hours and completely changed my understanding of everything that had happened. According to Dr. Hollins, Ethan had contacted her 6 months ago with suspicions about financial irregularities at his father's company. He'd noticed that profit margins were declining despite record sales numbers. He'd seen vendor payments that didn't match his understanding of actual services provided. He'd observed that the company's most successful contracts somehow generated less profit than expected. But here's the part that made me realize how wrong I'd been about everything. Ethan suspected me of the embezzlement. From his perspective, I was the only person who had access to all the major contracts where money was disappearing. I was the one negotiating vendor relationships. I was the one handling client communications. I was the one whose success never seemed to translate into proportional profits for the company. He thought I was somehow manipulating the contracts to steal money, and he'd been trying to build a case against me. When Dr. Hollins explained this to me, I actually laughed out loud. Ethan had been trying to protect his father's company from someone he thought was a sophisticated financial criminal. The reason he'd fired me via text message wasn't jealousy or spite. He'd finally convinced himself that he had enough evidence to act, and he wanted to cut off my access to company systems before I could steal more money or destroy evidence. The firing was supposed to be the first step in exposing my supposed crimes. He'd planned to spend the weekend going through my accounts with Dr. Hollins, building a case to present to authorities. Instead, my revenge had destroyed the company before he could discover that I was innocent. But Dr. Hollins had continued her investigation after the company collapsed, trying to understand what had actually happened. She'd been analyzing the financial records I'd provided during the acquisition process, and she'd identified the real embezzler. Janet Moreau, Hammond Solutions' chief financial officer, had been systematically stealing from the company for 4 years. She'd created an elaborate system of fake vendor accounts, phantom service contracts, and inflated billing that generated roughly $40,000 per month in untraceable income. She'd been smart enough to steal proportionally, taking money in amounts that wouldn't trigger automatic auditing systems. My family's subsidized pricing had been perfect cover for her crimes. Every time Caulfield Manufacturing saved Hammond Solutions money on legitimate costs, Janet was stealing equivalent amounts through fake charges. The company's thin profit margins weren't due to high supplier costs. They were due to systematic theft that my subsidies had been perfectly disguising. When I eliminated those subsidies, Janet's theft became immediately visible. The sudden increase in legitimate costs exposed the fake costs she'd been adding to every major contract. That's why the financial collapse had been so sudden and so complete. It wasn't just that supplier costs had increased. It was that the theft was no longer hidden. Dr. Hollins had traced Janet's activities through 5 years of records. The woman had stolen over $800,000 from Hammond Solutions, and she'd been preparing to steal much more. She'd recently opened new fake vendor accounts, created contracts for non-existent consulting services, and expanded her theft to smaller accounts that had previously been too risky to target. But here's where the story gets really interesting, and why my revenge ended up being more perfect than I could have ever planned. When Hammond Solutions collapsed, Janet panicked. She knew that any bankruptcy proceedings or acquisition process would involve financial auditing that could expose her crimes. So she did exactly what you'd expect a financial criminal to do when facing discovery. She tried to disappear. Janet submitted her resignation the day after I announced the acquisition, citing personal reasons and new opportunities. She requested immediate processing of her final paycheck, vacation payout, and retirement contributions. She wanted to be gone before I took control of the financial records. What Janet didn't know was that Dr. Hollins had already identified her as the primary suspect and had been monitoring her activities for weeks. When Janet tried to access company accounts to transfer her final theft proceeds, Dr. Hollins was ready with documentation, screenshots, and a complete financial trail. More importantly, Janet didn't know that I now legally owned all of Hammond Solutions' assets, including the right to pursue civil and criminal action for any crimes committed against the company. When she submitted fraudulent expense reports and fake vendor payments as part of her resignation package, she was literally stealing from me. I had 3 choices: let Janet disappear with the money she'd already stolen, try to recover the funds through civil litigation, or pursue criminal charges that might recover everything but would take years to resolve. I chose option 4, which wasn't actually an option until I created it. I called Janet and offered her a meeting to discuss transition details for the CFO position. I told her I was impressed with her financial management during the acquisition process and wanted to understand her systems before she left. I scheduled the meeting for the following Friday, in the conference room where I'd been sitting when Ethan sent that text message. Janet arrived exactly on time, carrying a briefcase full of financial documents that she claimed would help me understand the company's complex vendor relationships. She spent 30 minutes explaining invoicing procedures, payment schedules, and accounting systems that she'd designed to be deliberately confusing. What Janet didn't know was that Dr. Hollins was sitting in the next room with audio and video recording equipment, documenting every word of Janet's explanation of her own criminal enterprise. Every time Janet described a vendor relationship, she was actually explaining how she'd created fake companies to steal money. Every time she detailed an invoicing procedure, she was confessing to fraud. After Janet finished her presentation, I asked her one simple question. Janet, can you help me understand why Northbridge Consulting has been billing us for strategic planning services when I can't find any evidence that they've actually provided any deliverables? Northbridge Consulting was one of Janet's fake vendor companies. She'd created it 2 years ago and had been billing Hammond Solutions for monthly strategic planning services that never existed. The total theft through that single fake company was over $120,000. Janet's face went completely white. She stammered something about inherited vendor relationships and previous management decisions. Then she said something that I'll never forget. Indira, I think there might have been some irregularities in the previous financial management. I've been concerned about certain patterns, and I was actually planning to discuss this with you after the transition was complete. She tried to throw Ethan's father under the bus for her own crimes. She suggested that the previous ownership had been involved in questionable financial practices, and that she'd been trying to protect the company by quietly managing the situation. That's when I told her that Dr. Hollins had been investigating financial irregularities for 6 months, and that we had documentation of every fraudulent transaction she'd processed since 2021. I explained that the meeting had been recorded, and that her explanation of the vendor relationships had been a detailed confession to embezzlement and fraud. Janet tried to leave immediately, but Dr. Hollins entered the room with printed copies of bank records, fake vendor registrations, and transaction logs that proved Janet's crimes beyond any reasonable doubt. We offered Janet the same choice that prosecutors would eventually offer her: cooperation and partial restitution, or criminal charges and full prosecution. Janet chose cooperation. Over the next week, she provided complete documentation of her theft methods, returned over $200,000 from personal accounts, and testified about the financial damage her crimes had caused to Hammond Solutions' legitimate operations. But the real satisfaction wasn't the money or the confession. It was what happened when we called Ethan to explain what we'd discovered. Ethan cried when he learned the truth, not from anger or embarrassment, but from relief that his suspicions had been correct and guilt that he'd blamed the wrong person. He'd spent months thinking that someone was stealing from his father's company, watching the business struggle despite successful contracts, trying to protect employees and clients from what he thought was my financial manipulation. His decision to fire me had been completely wrong, but his instincts about the company being victimized had been absolutely correct. He'd just identified the wrong criminal. I offered Ethan his job back, not as a favor, not out of guilt, but because someone who cared enough about the company to investigate suspected crimes, even when it meant suspecting a successful colleague, was exactly the kind of person I wanted working for me. Ethan declined the offer, but for the right reasons. He said he wanted to finish his investigation training with Dr. Hollins and start a business helping small companies identify financial crimes before they became devastating. He wanted to prevent other families from experiencing what his father had gone through. The story ends with Hammond Solutions stronger than it had ever been, Caulfield Manufacturing operating as an official partner instead of a hidden subsidy, and Janet Moreau serving 18 months in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud. But most importantly, it ends with a text message that I sent to Ethan exactly 60 days after he'd fired me. It said, "Ethan, thank you for caring enough about your father's company to investigate when something felt wrong. You were right about the crime. You just had the wrong suspect. I hope you'll consider coming back when you're ready. We could use someone who pays attention." Ethan texted back 30 seconds later, "Indira, thank you for teaching me that revenge and justice aren't the same thing, but sometimes they lead to the same place." If this story taught you anything about paying attention to financial irregularities, trusting your instincts when something doesn't add up, or the importance of investigating before taking action, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever been wrongly accused of something you didn't do, let me know in the comments because I want to hear your story too. Sometimes the best revenge is discovering that you didn't need revenge at all. You just needed the truth.